Does Theresa May have what it takes? No coughing fit this time as the UK Prime Minister spelled out her goals before the House of Commons at the outset of a crucial week of negotiations with Europe. But after last week's Conservative Party Congress, she's still having to battle on two fronts. There's Brussels, and of course there are the hard Brexiteers within her own cabinet. Over the weekend, the PM hinted she would welcome a leadership challenge, a message to her own Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. Beyond the jockeying in the high halls of power, there are real choices to be made over whether the UK is ready to play by EU trade rules, over the rights of EU citizens in Britain, British citizens in the EU, and whether that land border with Ireland can stay open. What mandate for May? What direction for the United Kingdom? Today, in the France 24 debate, we're asking what Britain wants. With us from the UK capital, Patrick Sullivan, CEO of Political Researchers and Consultants, Parliament Street. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Rory Broomfield, Director of Better Off Out. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
Political commentator Nina Schick joins us as well from London. Thank you for being with us.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
And Adam Bienkhoff, UK politics editor at Business Insider. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. The UK Prime Minister, in her speech, saying there'll be no going back. Article 50 will not be reversed. But the clock is ticking in the build-up to March. So many were wondering, what is her plan?
I have been clear that when we leave the European Union, we will no longer be members of its single market or its customs union. The British people voted for control of their borders, their laws and their money, and that is what this government is going to deliver. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we want to find a creative solution to a new economic relationship that can support prosperity for all our peoples. We do not want to settle for adopting a model enjoyed by other countries.
Patrick Sullivan, did you learn anything new from Theresa May's speech before the Commons?
Not really, no. It seems to be more of the same. I mean, the Conservative Party is in disarray, and I think that she needs to come up with a better plan, really. So
what was the point of this? What was the point of this speech, and the fact that this was announced ahead of time that this would be an important one?
I think just to reassert her authority on the Conservative Party, and also people only remember the last speech you gave. So she wanted it to be this one and not the one that she gave last Wednesday, which didn't go down as well as she expected.
Rory Broomfield, you agree that the point of this speech was to make people forget the one that she gave in Manchester before the Conservative Party?
Well, it's certainly good to reiterate the policy. And as Prime Minister returning after the conference season, she had a new chance, a new opportunity to get more of her party behind her, to reiterate a clear and consistent policy, and in effect force the Labour Party into a corner. The Labour Party are chopping and changing their own policy and are dividing themselves as to how they approach this thing. And in the alternative matter, the government and Theresa May is now presenting a clear policy agenda.
A clear policy agenda?
Absolutely. So outside the European Economic Area, of course, she's said that model doesn't fit in the Florence speech, along with outside the customs union, outside the single market, and retaking the legal powers on the European Court of Justice, over the European Court of Justice, in the sense of getting UK courts to be able to reassert its opinions on laws made in the UK.
So is that a clean break in your view?
It is, and it is something that she has said before. And she started saying these sort of things in the Lancaster House speech earlier this year, which in my opinion was an excellent speech, articulating a global Britain that can stand on its own 2 feet in the world. And of course, in the Florence speech the other week, which was an ambitious speech opening up the agenda, giving a generous offer to the European Union, that is where I think the questions come. But certainly in terms of the core policy of outside the single market, outside the customs union, and with the red line of ECJ over the UK courts, then I think that's been a message that she's articulated time again and is clear and as concise as she ever was.
Lena Schick, you agree that there was clarity?
Well, I just need to weigh in here because Theresa May did say something very important today in the House of Commons, and that is that she implicitly accepted that the European Court of Justice would have jurisdiction over the UK during the period of the transition. Rory is absolutely right that Theresa May laid out in her Lancaster House speech that the UK would be leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. Now, why is that? That is because the UK wants to end free movement of people and it wants to have the power to negotiate its own free trade deals. Now, what happened in Florence is that the government has been mugged by reality and it realized it needed to move a little bit closer to the EU's position if any progress was to be made in talks at all. So that's when Theresa May said she would like a transition period, because it's very clear that in this 2-year negotiating period set out in Article 50, there's absolutely no way the UK can negotiate its new FTA with the EU. So that was already a retreat. And from the European perspective, that's seen as a step towards reality. Now, the next question that the government was fighting the EU on is what does that transition period look like? And of course, there were all kinds of red lines about how the ECJ cannot have jurisdiction within that transition period. But today, Theresa May further moved towards that position because regardless of how we look at it now, when you consider the infighting within the Conservative Party, also the infighting on the Labour side, they also have no clear Brexit strategy. The fact is the clock is ticking down and the UK's leverage in these talks is very much limited, and we won't see further progress until we make an agreement on the 3 items of the divorce. That's to do with the divorce settlement, i.e. the bill, citizens' right, and the very contentious and difficult question of what happens with the Northern Irish border.
What happens with the Northern Irish border? And as you say, the clock is ticking. The chair of Royal Bank of Scotland warns that with only 6 months to secure a deal with the EU to prevent the loss of jobs in the financial sector from turning into a mass exodus, the government has to act fast.
Can we provide an outcome which minimises that cost? It'll not remove it. It'll definitely be a cost. And the question is, can we negotiate enough market access so that that cost is at the margin? You know, is a few thousand people, not tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Thousands instead of tens of thousands. Adam Bienkov, which way is this headed? All right, we seem to...
I think undoubtedly there are businesses in the City of London right now who are already implementing contingency plans for what will happen in the event of a no deal. And we heard very clearly from Theresa May today that she is preparing for every eventuality, which includes a no deal Brexit. And I think that can be extremely worrying to a lot of businesses in the City of London. And these kind of decisions can't be taken overnight. We can't get to the end of the Brexit negotiations and suddenly businesses have to change their location and have to relocate workers to other parts of the EU. They're going to have to make these decisions within the next 3 months. So we need a really clear strategy from Theresa May, exactly what the future trading relationship is going to be like. And she said today that she wants a creative and unique solution. And there's lots of rhetoric over the recent months that she wants a unique partnership with the EU, but there's no clear strategy about what that actually means in practice. And businesses need to know what that means, what the reality of that means to their trade and to their business.
Is there no strategy, or is it just that she's playing her cards close to her chest?
Well, we only have until next October when the final Brexit deal needs to be wrapped up and go to ratification for the EU Parliament. And the longer this period goes on, the less it looks like she's got her cards close to her chest, and the more it looks like she really doesn't have any strategy at all when it comes to the details of negotiating a future relationship with the EU. And I think what we saw today in the House of Commons is more about the Prime Minister negotiating with her own party than it is about setting out her strategy for talks with the EU.
Setting her own party rather than setting out the strategy for the EU. And Nina Schick, you mentioned how Ireland was important. There was a leaked report from Ireland's Revenue Commission which says that well, it's just not feasible to have an open border agreement once there's Brexit.
Absolutely, and that is a report that needs to be read in conjunction with the customs union suggestions which the British government released today, because the Irish report goes into far greater detail. Now, I've been hearing from the Commission, because both sides in this debate want to ensure that there is no return to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So they are very, very cautious. And I think that when it comes to Ireland, Northern Ireland, perhaps some kind of deal can be struck where Northern Ireland gets special status. Nonetheless, this is an extremely difficult and contentious issue, and it is one that has really worried politicians in Ireland as well. If you look at what the Irish Taoiseach has been saying, he was one of the most adamant of the EU leaders, saying that we will veto progress to the next stage of the talks unless the UK can come up with something a little bit more substantial on the issue of the Irish border. And it's one that British politicians, perhaps here in Westminster, have been neglecting. If you look at how the Tory party has been infighting and how the issue of Ireland barely gets a mention, the fact that British diplomats, Westminster politicians are not in Northern Ireland or Ireland trying to soothe over this issue is really quite alarming. And I think that it has upset a lot of Irish politicians for obvious reasons.
Patrick Sullivan, the Irish are upset, and there's also this tit for tat with Brussels. Theresa May saying the ball is in the court of the EU. The Commission spokesperson saying, no, it is not. It is still in the ball of Britain. Of course, he made those remarks before the speech. Is the ball, in whose court is the ball?
I think the ball is very much in Britain's court, but the problem is when David Cameron called the referendum, he thought that Britain was going to vote to remain, and he told the civil service not to prepare. So Theresa May is suddenly got this position where she's inherited Brexit, which was voted for not just by Conservatives but also by a lot of people who were Labour Party supporters. And suddenly there's no blueprint, so she's got to sort of make it up on the fly as she's going along. And something as complicated as Brexit can't be made up on the fly. And I think the deadline that we've got so the end of 2019 is just ridiculous, because you're not going to get a deal by that time.
Will it be rolled back?
It's too complicated. I think it has to be rolled back, or there would have to be transitional arrangements, yes, made, absolutely.
Rory Broomfield, do you agree with Patrick that the ball is still in the UK's court at this point?
Well, the ambitious and generous offer that Theresa May made in her Florence speech has to be absorbed by the European Union, and there is a process to do that, it seems, with the talks that are ongoing. The idea, though, that we can not leave and leave the single market and what have you after March 2019, it's a legal matter. We've invoked Article 50. Article 50 is going through the processes. Yes, it can be extended with unanimity in the Council, but it seems quite far from that possibility happening right now. What needs to happen right now is that the Conservative Party needs to have a united governmental framework with the civil service and other departments, because it's definitely got its backbenchers in line in terms of the Brexit issue, to come up with concise and consistent messaging and indeed policy that reflects the core belief that the Prime Minister outlined today.
Yeah, let me ask you about that, Rory, because it's not just within the government. There seems to be a loss of trust with the civil service. Conservative Member of Parliament Bernard Jenkins says he's not calling for any cabinet members' head, but he wrote a piece in the in The Guardian that takes direct aim at Philip Hammond's civil service, the Treasury, which he says seems unable to hear any voices except those that reinforce their preconceptions. It seems blind to the facts, preoccupied with preserving access to the EU market seemingly at any cost. Is that ideology, or is it just that the civil servants have a better grasp of reality?
Well, the Treasury have been acting disgracefully over many months, indeed during the time of George Osborne's stewardship of the Treasury, where, as Patrick mentioned with David Cameron, he tried to or at least impede the Treasury from putting out truthful statements concerning the aftermath of the Brexit vote. Of course, there was the famous claim that we would be worse off in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote, which has proven not to be true. So it is a Treasury mindset to, in effect, ignore what the British people are saying and go about what it thinks is the best for its own agenda.
All right, so
and indeed the agenda of the civil service.
Just quickly before we go to the break, Patrick Sullivan, do you agree that there's an ideological bend inside the Treasury?
Well, yes, there is an ideological bend inside the Treasury. And there's an ideological bend within the civil service. I mean, most of these people sort of drank the sort of EU Kool-Aid, as the Americans would put it. They've sort of been trained in sort of how the European institutions work, and they all wanted to remain. So I haven't met a single civil servant, and I have to deal with quite a few of them, who actually supported Brexit. So as a result, they're not sort of implementing Brexit in the way that maybe the British people wanted.
All right, we're gonna pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
Straddling the border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the Aral Sea has a surface area of 66,000 kilometers square, twice the size of Belgium. In 1950, the Soviet Union diverted 2 rivers which fed the sea to irrigate their fields for large-scale cotton production. In 50 years, the Aral Sea lost 90% of its waters, leaving behind swathes of desert and ruining thousands of livelihoods. It seemed it was lost forever, but things have improved over 10 years thanks to a new dam. The water's rising gradually, with it the hopes of the inhabitants.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Turkey has summoned a second employee at the U.S. consulate in Istanbul. Washington has suspended visa service after last week's arrest of a first staff member there. The International Red Cross scales back its presence in parts of Afghanistan, this after a string of killings and abductions of staff members. Angela Merkel officially invites the Liberals and Greens to enter into coalition talks. This as longtime Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble attends his final Eurogroup meeting in Brussels before becoming Speaker of Parliament. And check your change if you're in the UK. It's the last week when old pound coins are still in circulation. William Hildebrand will have all the day's business news. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We heard the British Prime Minister speak to the Commons earlier at the outset of a week of crucial Brexit negotiations in Brussels. Our panel agreeing a lot of the rhetoric was directed it was more for domestic consumption, if you will, than for those on this side of the English Channel. With us to talk about it from London, Patrick Sullivan, CEO of Parliament Street, political and researchers and consultants. Also with us, Rory Broomfield, welcome back, Director of Better Off Out, political commentator. Nina Schick is also with us in London, as is Adam Bienkhoff, the UK politics editor at Business Insider. Nina Schick, you heard just before the break, Patrick Sullivan and Rory Broomfield agree that the Treasury has a bit of a bend, is perhaps, well, dragging its heels when it comes to getting on board the Brexit bandwagon?
Look, the fundamental problem is that Brexit is a damage control exercise on both sides. And I think that you see the hysteria this debate has stirred up in this country when you have MPs like Bernard Jenkins, right? That rather fabulous magnum opus in The Guardian where he accuses the Treasury of being in cahoots with the EU and trying to sabotage Brexit. I mean, this is an absolute nonsense. It is the responsibility of the Treasury to make sure that this exercise will cause the least economic harm to the UK possible. We already know that the UK is leaving the single market and leaving the customs union, and nobody is arguing that this is going to be overturned, because indeed the government has decided it will take this choice because it wants to control immigration, it wants to end free movement of people, and it wants to have the ability to negotiate its own free trade deals once it's left the EU. However, to argue that the Treasury is now trying to sabotage this process is simply ridiculous, because I think the problem is that people or politicians in this country haven't been honest about the inevitable trade-offs that come with the path of Brexit that the UK is now on. So it's about market access versus controls on immigration. And the fact is that this, glorious silver bullet Brexit, where you have your cake and eat it too, where you're outside of the single market, outside of the customs union, but still have all the memberships, benefits of being in the single market, well, it's simply not true. And that is what we've seen in Theresa May's speech in the Commons today. That's what we saw in her speech in Florence, that she has been moving towards the EU's position. So the government is in the process of being mugged by reality, and the choices it faces right now are, does it agree to a transitional agreement, a period, under which the rules basically stay the same, or if it is unable to gather, if the Conservative Party is unable to agree to that transitional agreement, well, then we have the crash out option, and that would be very disruptive both to the UK and to the EU.
Adam Bienkhoff, we're seeing that the crash-out option is more and more something that's being thought about in London.
Well, certainly today in her speech, Theresa May was quite explicit that they are considering that as a possibility. I think what is more worrying, I think most of the people in the senior levels of government believe that a no-deal Brexit would be extremely damaging to the UK and the UK economy. I do think there is a movement within the Conservative Party, however, who actively would like a no-deal Brexit. And I do think there is this attitude among some Brexit supporters, including some in the government, unfortunately, that they have almost sort of R. Kelly version of Brexit. If we just believe in it enough, if I believe I can fly, then I can fly. And it really isn't the case. This is going to be the most difficult period of negotiation and logistical changes to the British Constitution and to our entire system of government that we've had since the Second World War. And this isn't it's not simple. There's nobody in government trying to sabotage this. There is a lot of people are completely overwhelmed with the scale of this task and are desperately trying to make it worse. As Nina says, this is really a damage limitation process. And the ideology, I think, is really on the other side, on the Brexit supporting side, of people who just believe in Brexit and want to push this through regardless of the damage that it does to the British economy and to the British people.
All right, yeah, Theresa May, who, just to remind our viewers, had called a snap election to shore up her bargaining position with Europe, and instead wound up with a minority government, hence all the attention on her big speech last week before the Conservative Party Congress in Manchester. Her coughing fit, seen by critics as a parable for what ails her leadership. Many wonder if the writing is on the wall or not, like when the letters on the sign behind her started to fall. At the same party conference, her foreign secretary's words were, seemed to be damning with faint praise at times.
And prepare for a run on. You won. We won. 56 seats ahead. Theresa May won.
Theresa May won. Patrick Sullivan, even when I was reading that piece we talked about earlier in The Guardian, I was wondering, was he taking aim at the civil service? Was he taking aim at Philip Hammond, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's more in favour of a softer Brexit than Boris Johnson? Daggers seem drawn within the Conservative Party.
Well, I think there are 2 points that I'd like to make here. Going on with the song theme, I think the Conservative Party's tune at the moment is Better the Devil You Know, because what happens is those that are afraid of a Boris Johnson and a hard Brexit and Boris Johnson's sort of more undiplomatic diplomacy will keep Theresa May. And then on the other side, those that are afraid of a sort of George Osborne candidate trust Theresa May to deliver some sort of Brexit. So again, they're happy with Theresa May. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're all Mayites, but I think out of all the options they have, she is the best one for both sides. The other thing, talking about George Osborne, is I have never seen somebody's opponent shore up somebody before. The foiled attacks on her last week just did enough to scare hardcore Brexiteers of what would happen if May went. Because, you know, you had people like Ed Vaizey and Grant Shapps, who've never been liked by the right, as the main assassins. So
yeah, because what's the scenario here, Patrick? If she's forced out somehow, it would be, how would it work? Historically, what happens when a prime minister is forced out by her own party, like Margaret Thatcher was, for instance?
Well, I mean, with the Conservative Party, the whole point is you just don't want to be the heir apparent. The heir apparent hasn't won a Conservative Party leadership contest since since it ever started. I mean, Alec Douglas-Stone was selected instead of Rab Butler in 1964. Everybody, a bit more recently, in 2001, everybody thought Ken Clarke was going to be leader, and then you ended up with William Hague, who no one had heard of. When William Hague resigned, everybody thought it was going to be Michael Portillo, and you ended up with Ian Douglas-Smith, who no one had heard of. And the basic thing is the Conservative Party always votes against somebody. It never votes for somebody. And as a result, I think we've seen this as a very unpredictable political climate. You don't know what you're going to get. I mean, also look at the Labour Party, and they had a leadership election and they ended up with the candidate they never thought they'd get. So, yeah, it's all very unpredictable right now.
Very unpredictable right now. Asked in the Sunday Times if a reshuffle was in the stars, the Prime Minister this weekend suggesting she could be the one doing the sacking, not the other way around. It has never been my style to hide from a challenge, and I'm not going to start now. I'm the PM, and part of my job is to make sure I always have the best people in my cabinet to make the most of the wealth of talent available to me in the party. Of course, Rory Broomfield, everyone taking that as a warning shot to Boris Johnson. So what would you like to see happen? Theresa May sacked or a cabinet reshuffle with her staying in charge?
Oh, well, Theresa May staying on in the Brexit negotiations. We need calm, conciliatory and indeed confident measures going forward with regards to Brexit policy. And in terms of the song theme, I'm joining in with George Michael's Freedom, in that should be the song for government, because ultimately, in this case, we're taking back control over our borders, our laws, and indeed our money. and setting the agenda for an optimistic United Kingdom for the benefit of the British people going forward, not just for the next few years, but for many generations to come. This is a very confident, optimistic ideal, and of course the government needs to get back to the agenda that is delivering Brexit.
But does Theresa May have what it takes? Does Theresa May have what it takes to navigate tricky waters ahead?
Well, I think what you'll see as they measured response to the speech that she gave today is a confident backbench going forward with the Prime Minister supporting her in her endeavours, and in terms of Brexit, wanting to deliver for the British people who voted to leave the European Union.
Nina Schick, what's your prediction? Will she be doing the firing, or will she be the one who gets fired?
Look, the only reason Theresa May is still in post is because that it would be an absolute irresponsibility on behalf of the Conservative Party if, after having triggered Article 50, calling an unnecessary general election now, for the next 3 months, they are in some kind of leadership debate. They're obviously scared that if there is another general election unleashed, that Jeremy Corbyn will become the next Prime Minister. I mean, you only had to be at the Conservative Party last week to see what the mood was there compared to Labour Party conference. Now, I think that if you subscribe to the theory, economic theory of gravity, as I do, there will be an economic impact on the UK, because leaving the world's largest market and your most important trading partner, leaving that area, is a form of setting up a trade barrier. Okay, so even though the British people voted to leave, and that's a prerogative, I think that politicians have to be very, very honest about the trade-offs this inevitably brings. The fact is that with regards to taking back control of regulation, that also is an assert set. So what Theresa May said today during the transition, they will continue to accept jurisdiction of the ECJ. It's already clear that the UK will have to continue paying to the EU. So I think that reality needs to set into the debate here very, very quickly, because if not, we're heading towards the crash out scenario. And I'm strongly convinced that that would not be the best option for anybody.
Nina, it's been 18 months since that referendum where the UK voted for Brexit. Today, which way are citizens going? Are they going... You mentioned the fact that the left has the wind in its sails, but are they going for a more withdrawn isolationist UK, a more open UK? Are they more or less in favor of Europe than they were then?
Well, I think that the issue has obviously divided the country almost bang down the middle. So the people that thought Remain was the right option stick strongly to that view, and people who voted Leave stick also strongly to that view. I think the issue or the problem is that society here there are many tough questions facing the UK, from economic productivity to upskilling the labour market. And Brexit was presented as a silver bullet that would be the answer to all of those woes. And of course, that is not going to be the case. And I fear that if politicians are not more honest with the electorate, that inevitably this will erode confidence and trust in the British political system. And that's truly sad for a country that has been one of the greatest democracies if you look at British history. And I think that the Conservative Party in particular will pay a price for this, particularly amongst younger voters. I don't think the huge surge to Labour is necessarily because people think that Jeremy Corbyn is the best option for the country, but also has a lot to do with how people are losing confidence in the Conservative Party.
A lot to do with how they're losing confidence in the Conservative Party. Adam Bienkhoff, you heard Rory Broomfield earlier saying, hey, the doomsday predictions that the UK economy would collapse the day after Brexit haven't materialized. Are we perhaps scaremongering? Are we overplaying the dangers that lie ahead?
No, not at all. And I think actually they have materialised. We saw straight after the referendum result, the pound collapsed. It's continued at a very low level ever since. We've seen the latest growth figures. The UK is now the slowest growing economy in the G7. And I think we're only just beginning to see the signs of the economy weakening. I think as we approach the end of Brexit negotiations, as it becomes clearer and clearer that we're not going to get anything like a comprehensive free trade deal with the EU, I think the economy is inevitably going to suffer. And we've already seen it so far. We've already seen prices going up. People are already suffering in their pockets as a result of the decision to leave the EU. And I think as we approach the end of the negotiation period, this will become much more apparent to voters. I think we will start to see some sort of shift towards remaining within the EU, although whether or not it'll be enough to actually prevent that outcome, I think is less likely.
Patrick Sullivan, the Prime Minister, in the Commons today, reiterating that there won't be a reversal of Article 50. What does it tell you, the fact that she actually had to say that?
Well, I don't really think there's going to be a second referendum. I think Jeremy Corbyn is actually probably more in favour of Brexit than Theresa May. I remember when I was about sort of 16, going through a libertarian phase, I went through to all these sort of Leave events, which were very small, all held in sort of churches or what have you, mostly elderly people, and they're very small crowds. But Tony Benn, who was basically the political mentor of Jeremy Corbyn, was always the token left-winger there. He'd been campaigning for Brexit since we came in. Actually, he campaigned for us not to join. So the hard left in Britain has no love for the EU because they view the EU as a sort of capitalist club. So I think that the Liberal Democrats aren't big enough to. I know Vince Cable, is saying that we should have an exit from Brexit, but I just don't think his voice is loud enough, and for that. So I think.
Do you agree on that point with Nina Schick, who says that, well, if you look today at the population in Britain and the general mood, it's pretty much the same as it was 18 months ago when there was the Brexit referendum?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think it's changed at all. I don't think the problems in our political system that have led to high unemployment in areas in the north of England, such as Sunderland, high labour areas, have been dealt with. I think a lot of what happened in the referendum was people wanted to throw, as Michael Moore said about the election of Trump, a Molotov cocktail at the political establishment. What we've had with Brexit was the replacement of the 2010 Tory cabinet with the 2001 Tory shadow cabinet. So you haven't actually had much of a shake-up of our political system at all. So I think if there was a sort of second referendum, people would still vote to leave because people are just upset with the status quo, and that's our political system, our electoral system, etc.
Yeah, Rory Broomfield, that was the way a lot of people perceived it from this side of the channel, which was that, well, the Brexit vote happened because of an argument within the cabinet among the Conservatives.
Well, I don't believe that to be true. The Brexit vote happened, at least in terms of on June the 23rd last year, and polls do suggest this to be the case because people wanted to take back control over their legal system, their borders, their money, and indeed their futures. And this was, I think, very clear in the intentions of voting. And for
but you heard Patrick Sullivan there talk about how the political class that's in charge right now is backwards thinking, doesn't have a new vision when it comes to what happens next.
Well, look at what Theresa May said in the Florence speech. Look at what she said today. She's presenting a new and ambitious and generous offer to the European Union. And this is where the European Union needs to react to say, OK, let's discuss things like defence, security and everything else that the UK has put forward. And indeed, the UK has put forward many papers across all departments, it seems, as to where they wish the negotiations to go in terms of their platform and the EU needs to receive those and to deal with them accordingly. Barnier needs to look at those and go back to the member states and get concessions. He really needs to become a true negotiator rather than a pigeon boy for the EU member states.
All right, Rory Broomfield, in disagreement there, I know, with Nina Schick, but we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining us from London. I want to thank as well Patrick Sullivan and Adam Bienkopf. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.